All right. Well, Margie, why don't you take over one of the thoughts that you wanted to talk about? Whichever
Sure.
one speaks out to you.
Yeah. So one of the major kind of themes that I've noticed come up for myself as a female, and working through a faith transition is, and my keynote was largely around this topic. My coming home keynote was this idea of, not recognizing, not hearing or connecting with our inner voices, or that. And so what happens over time is, when we're not connecting with that, when we're not really is we fall to the structure. We're more apt to fall to the formula, to the structure. And just with a lot of the women in particular that I work with, there's a lot of this. There's a lot of kind of years later, this sense of, who am I? Looking back, I can see that I was uncomfortable with this, but I didn't voice it, or I didn't say, and we actually had a couple of comments with regard to this. This idea. Lexi wrote in saying, the most positive thing that has come from my faith crisis is simply the benefit of becoming a more critical thinker. My journey started with Mormonism, but it continued on into other faiths, science, and education in general. This idea of cultivating our own ideas, our own thoughts, and being able to truly honor, that experience. As well, we had another comment, on about reclaiming authority. Tammy wrote, reclaiming my authority. It feels so empowering. So anyway, I think there's a lot to be said about, what is kind of lost in the structure, and losing kind of the value of our own intuition, our own ability to kind of create ourselves, our lives, our dreams, and not only that, but to voice those, to actually allow for them to be heard and to ask for those things. And so that's something that I have experienced in something.
Do you have some examples?
Oh, sure. So and I think we've gone into them on some other episodes, but, this plays out in self-exploration in your 20s, in moving from one dependent relationship right into another and being married. So going from, and never really being an independent self that, is exploring what I want my dreams to be, or what I would, I don't know, just kind of my sense of who I was at the time, how many children we had, how I wanted to navigate having a job or being at home, or what that would look like. I just feel like there was a shutdown mode that I feel like I bought into a structure, and it was like an overwrite system. It filled in all those gaps. Yes, it filled in. But what happens in a transition is all those plugs, when you go through a transition, they come out of you, and you're left with all those holes, those places you didn't explore.
I've probably talked about this before, but again, just trying to make this personal. I know that when I was done at BYU, Margie still had a year or two to go. And I got a job offer, and I was really worried about being able to be that single provider of income to the family. And so I didn't give a thought about just leaving BYU, having Margie come with me, and letting her figure out her education through distance ed later. I regret that now. I wish we had stayed and let her finish her degree and pursue a graduate degree if she had wanted to, because you had always wanted to get a master's of English. And I was just like, oh, well, that's nice that you wanted that, but we got to go do my career now, because we got to have kids and we got to get on the Mormon train. And I don't know how a master's degree is going to help us on the Mormon train. So that's something I feel bad about. And then, of course, you probably wanted 2 to 3 kids. I wanted 4 to 6 kids. And when you were like, I'm not sure I want a 4th, I'm just like, I'm pretty sure we're having a 4th, is that okay? It wasn't like I just stomped all over you, but it was basically going to be my way. I felt like, at least 4. And I feel bad about that. Not to mention the fact that you wanted to pursue maybe a teaching career or whatever. Can you talk about the flip side of that, since our faith crisis, personally, what what awakening or empowerment have you experienced, and what did that look like?
Yeah, so a lot of this is in my coming home keynote, but I do feel like,
which we'll share, which was Margi's Thrive presentation. So we'll share that.
Yeah, but I do feel like you kind of, once you realize those, amidst transition, you have these crumbled towers that once stood, or you're going to have to rebuild a little bit. I do feel like I've taken time to kind of, and when we talk about voice, we bring up these big decisions, but you know what? I mean, listening to your voice, these things can be smaller everyday things, right? The fact that you don't always have to give food to your kids, all the best things to other people, or, the voice, there are subtle honorings of voice too. Giving yourself, acknowledging that my personality is introverted. I like to actually move slower through my world than John does, and actually giving voice to that as a valid way to live. That was a really huge part to, amidst my transition part too, is just, really allowing and honoring space for you to get outside a hustle, to get outside a system. And you know what? I don't know if you remember this, but one other area, we were living in DC. We were about to move. John and I were working at SRA, but before we moved for a job for John, I had just gotten a job at one of the most prestigious clubs in DC, and they were going to train me to be a health club, to be a personal trainer. They were going to pay for it. And at that time, that was something I was really interested in. So I had left my education. Here we're in a situation where they're willing to pay for me to become a personal trainer and be a personal trainer at this very exclusive club. And I was thrilled. And I never even vocalized to John that I really wanted it. It was like, well, he got the job, so obviously we're moving. And, it's like little things like that over time that I just think add up. And so what you do is you go back and you reclaim that. So becoming a life coach, or, being able now
Can you tell that story, or just briefly, like, what did you do?
So I think what I realized over time was that there was this space that I naturally inhabited, and people were naturally asking questions a lot of me. And so I feel like my natural interests over the years for health and relationships, and reading all these books that I was storing in my brain, and I would use them in my own family life, right? So I definitely put them to use, but it was all in my brain. It was all like living inside of me. And so what I felt like was, well, what would happen if I actually moved into a space where I'm naturally interested, where I've naturally, I feel like not schooled myself, but I have really been proactive about educating myself with a lot of the best kind of the leaders of the field. What would happen if I just kind of shared that in this space? What would happen if I grew my own space of doing that? And it actually honored me. I'm much more of a one-on-one person versus a huge group person. And so all of this was creating a life that I feel like allowed for me to be fully myself. And it was really honoring to my personality and what I love. And now I have this space here on the podcast. And I also have this practice that is deeply honoring to me as a human being, but I also feel like allows me to do something I really love, and I go through this process with other people that I feel like is truly beautiful. And honestly, it feels like sacred to be in that space with people where they're sharing all sorts of things. And so that's an example of going back to a wound and then sort of and having it reflect the person I am now. So I didn't get an English master's, did I? I mean, it's not the same dream of 2 decades ago, right? Because it reflects sort of where I am now and kind of the person I am now. So
do you feel happier and more whole or stronger or more complete?
I do. I do feel like there was a part of me that was a little more dormant, maybe a little more undeveloped, that took a back seat for many years. And now I feel like that part of me has, now I have plants growing in that place. I've got actually a world that I have created and an aspect of myself that was in the dark that now lives in the light and is part of me.
And I just have to say, and Natasha, I really want to hear from you on this. The weird thing for me is that Margi's empowerment has not been threatening to me. It's actually been, it's not that I didn't respect her before, but I really respect her, what she does as a professional. I respect what she does as a coach. I respect her wisdom. I respect her as kind of a business partner in her nonprofit stuff. And she's happier and stronger. And that is attractive to me. And I think it's better for our marriage for us to be standing strong together versus leaning on each other. But then there's always the risk of falling down, or one of us is weaker, or one of us is stronger. Sometimes maybe it felt a little bit unequal, but not that I was better, but just, I don't know. But what I can say is, like, right now, and over the past 7 years, it's just gotten better and better. I feel like I'm more attracted to you now. I feel there's more respect and there's more strength in our relationship the stronger you've gotten. And that's one of the things I love, is it's a win-win. Let's just say your marriage is in disarray after a faith crisis. If you as a woman get stronger, it's a win-win. Either hopefully it will be something that your husband respects and is attracted to more, or you'll become strong and ready for whatever you want to do if your marriage doesn't work out, which may include another relationship. It may include independence, who knows? But I just think a woman benefits by becoming more stronger, more developed, either way, regardless of what happens. So it's kind of a win-win-win. So Natasha, please jump in here.
No, I think it's one of the ways that the Mormon Church does the biggest disservice to women, is to not allow them to self-develop. And I would like to just read a few comments that you're getting, Margi, as you're talking. So Cammie Beath says, I totally agree, Margi. I couldn't trust myself when I thought I had to fit into a Mormon box. It is so freeing to listen to my own thoughts and give them space and weight in my mind. And April Newman says, I really agree, Margi. I was just telling my husband that I don't know. I've really thought for myself almost my whole life. I got married young. Hubby's older than me. I just listened to the structure of church and my thoughts followed. Or I looked for my husband often for answers. They didn't always sit well, but I just moved on, buried in kids and mom fog. I know there were times I did think for myself, but never critically looked on how I really felt. It has been very empowering for me through this faith crisis.
Beautiful.
And I think, to your point, John, feminist ideals help all genders.
Everyone.
Right.
It helps everybody. And pigeonholing people into boxes of what they should or shouldn't be or do because they have a vagina or a penis or something in between, which we don't even talk about, is extremely harmful to the human soul and to human relationships. And there's so much, I don't think I need to speak much further. I would agree, Margi, with my experiences being very similar. Most of my very tear-driven conversations with my husband is trying to explain like how the yes and, like, yes, I know you love me, and yes, I know you support me, and yes, I know you're proud of me, and my life has still been completely, predicated by your job, your career, your identity. And that's been hard for Andy to understand sometimes, because he does love me and he is proud of the things I do. And so I think he takes it almost too personal when I bring these things up, like, but wait a minute, that means that I'm not a good husband, right? Or that means that I forced you to do things and that was never my intent. And it wasn't so much that he forced me to do anything. These are decisions that we made together, but it was in the construct of the shoulds of what I should be, that my Mormonism gave me, that my culture gave me, that I would say even, aspects of American culture gave me, that really didn't allow me to share my voice. And I think, your point, the little title that you've made to your point, is it's silencing our voices. And that's very much how I felt too. My life would be very different if I had known how to advocate for my ideas or my career or my thoughts or my choices, because I too, just like him, he was also harmed by that. I mean, I want to talk about this from the men's perspective
Right.
next
Right.
time, because they also have the shoulds of what they should be doing.
Yep.
So we're both caught in that trap of the shoulds of the gender roles that are imposed upon us.
Yes.
So, yep. But if we ever divorce, I'll tell you this, his earning potential wasn't hurt by my shoulds, whereas my earning potential definitely was.
Right.
So
right.
that's a huge difference for women, usually.
Yep. So true.
Love it.
John, what about one of your points?
Well, I feel like I shouldn't be giving my perspective here about women, but
he said that a few times, and then I'm like, well, am I not going to give my perspective when we talk about men? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So please, I think you've got great perspectives.
Yeah,
I think it's good for us to hear from men about things that they see us struggling with, or.
Yeah. So a couple of the things that I see really common with women in a faith crisis, although I will say that these things also occur in men, and I don't want to make it sound like they're gendered. And also, I do think sometimes these things are tied more to the believer versus the non-believer in a mixed faith marriage. But I'll just list a couple. I do feel like when a faith crisis happens in a couple, I've noticed that more often for women than men, there's this real immediate concern. Number one, about the eternal family. Is our eternal family destroyed? And accompanying that is a real immediate fear: is my partner going to cheat on me? Now that he's had a faith crisis, and I can't say it enough that this isn't necessarily gendered, but I do think those are two really common reactions in a faith crisis. And I'm just curious, how have each of you? I would love to hear how each of you have dealt with those fears or concerns in your own relationships or with the people you've coached. So let's start with the fear around eternal family. For the women out there who are like, yeah, faith crisis, now I don't know about, will I see my husband again? Will we be together in heaven? Will we see our kids? How have each of you worked that out? Natasha, I'll start with you on that one.
Well, before I even talk personally, I think that this is really interesting that you just brought up these two topics, which in a sense partner the two things Margie and I talked about, because one of them is really having to do with that mother identity that's shoved down our throats, right? And that somehow we're responsible for the caretaking of the entire family structure and getting them to heaven, because after all, you guys aren't that righteous to begin with, so it's on us. And secondly, and then the second part is that sexuality piece, right? That somehow if we don't have this structure of Mormonism, that's a threat to our sexual ownership of each other, which is really what it is about. Because now we're going to step away from that ownership model. And that's very scary as to what that could maybe bring about. So I think it's interesting that those are the two things you've seen, at least from what it sounds like the believing female partner in some heterosexual marriages struggle with if they have a faith transitioning spouse. Now, I was the faith transitioner ahead of my husband. I was kind of drug him along with all of my social justice issues, all of the issues I was seeing in my practice, all the things that I felt, weren't necessarily sitting well with me, for years. So he's kind of been two steps behind me the whole time. So I kind of felt those things. I didn't feel the infidelity issue as much, but I definitely felt am I steering my family into a space that, and we hear this oftentimes over the pulpit. What will they say to transitioners is your actions will affect generations to come. If you step away from the church, you will, in essence, be derailing not only your life, but the life of generations to come. And so it's a very fear-driven type of narrative, which laughs in the face of agency, which is what we supposedly believe in. But and so I definitely have had those moments where, even though I felt very much like I was listening to my inner voice, like you talked about, Margie, those doubts would come in. Anytime we ran across an issue, maybe my kid got a bad grade, or my daughter's dealing with depression, or something's happening. As soon as there's an issue, because again, we come from equational Mormonism, where all good things come from blessings and all bad things come from, sins, unless of course you're living the perfect life, and then it's a trial, right? But it's like these weird narratives that we have, that I really, even though I didn't necessarily literally believe in them anymore, it was a struggle for me to get away from that idea that I was personally responsible as the mother figure of my family to not derail the whole system for everybody.
Yeah.
So what is your theology around the afterlife and marriage and united families, Natasha, now that you've gone through a faith crisis? And you're still a believer at some level, right?
Yeah, so I choose to talk about my belief in the format of hope, so I guess I'm an agnostic, hopeful Mormon in the sense of, I hope there's an afterlife. I hope I get to have relationships with loved ones that I choose to be in relationship with after this time. I hope my energy lives on after this life. Those are all things I'm very hopeful for. I hope in the divine being. I hope in a lot of the things that I think are constructed in a Mormon testimony. At the same time, I think, as a relational expert and gospel principles that I see come out specifically out of the New Testament and some of the Book of Mormon, that's the main testing ground. Whether I'm going to see it as literal or symbolic, this life I'm leading here is a testing ground where I get to practice in the forms of relationships with people that I love. So that resonates with me in Mormon stories, right? The Mormon story of coming down and being in a family setting and learning and going through things. And but I think what I've really learned, or what I want to practice more than anything, is that the relational aspects always have to win over the doctrinal ones, always. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I fail.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What about the theology of a loving God that's going to be dividing loving couples and couples from children, depending on the ordinances they've received or not, or the faithfulness on the moment they died versus a year earlier or 20 years, what they would have done if they hadn't died? Like, just this idea of a God that's breaking up marriages and families and not letting people stay together.
I think that's super silly. I think that we have lots of wonderful Christ-like teachings, again, that kind of made fun of legalistic ways, Pharisaical ways of looking at religious living. And that's what Christ was all about, was kind of like saying, this is kind of stupid what you guys are doing. And why? Why are you doing these stupid things with these stupid little rules that you've kind of come up with in your own heads? And to think that we have any idea as to, I feel like either we're worms afterwards, we turn into dirt, or we have an eternity. The whole concept of eternity is just so mind-blowing. No wonder we try to limit it, because we can't handle the mind-blowingness of it all. We don't have any business, predicting what we think is going to happen, especially in ways that harm us right now.
Yeah, exactly.
To live in a way where you think what's going to happen in the future that harms your relationships right now, I think is a tragedy. And when our leaders encourage for that, I think that's sin they should be called out on.
Mm-hmm. How could, let's just say there's a believing Mormon woman, post-Mormon, liberal, progressive Mormon out there, that woman who's like, wow, well, I've always relied on the brethren to tell me what the doctrine and the theology is. What other choice do I have? What would you say to them, Natasha, if they're like, well, my picture of heaven is based on what I've been told heaven's going to be like?
Yeah, and I think that I used to feel that way too, until you start really looking at our history, and then you're going to have to sit with that discomfort anyway, because our leaders have said tons of weird things that they've taken back, things that they've decided, oh, now we realize we were biased on. So I think that there's, when you look at it from a human developmental space, and even when you look at it, I think from Mormon doctrine, there is this idea of you develop And when you've learned one concept, you go to the next. That's basic psychology, developmental theories. And even in Mormon doctrine, the idea is, can you become as God, not under God? So if you're going to become as God, yeah, at some point, you're going to have to stop listening to other people, or what other people have to say, even if it's well-intentioned, may not be exactly the right answer. So if you want to be the type of member that relies heavily on the authority of priesthood leaders, there may be times or certain types of personalities that need some of that, or times in your life where you need some of that, versus other times. And when you're ready to move on into something different, then you'll have to sit with that discomfort that no longer sits well for you. And I think that's why, as people who are transitioning, we can't say, oh, it's always bad that you listen to the leaders, or people who are like always listening to leaders say it's bad if you don't. Because we all have times when we need more authority in our lives versus less, depending on where we're at in a developmental structure. But if your idea is that the priesthood leaders have always said the same thing forever, well, then you're kind of in for a sad surprise if you do any type of basic 101 history in Mormonism.
And I just, I think about, our now in 2019, what Mormon leaders are basically saying is we're not perfect. We make mistakes. They did polygamy, then they took polygamy away. They kept priesthood from Black people and kept Black people out of the temples, and then they gave it to them. And they did the November 2015 policy with LGBT people, where they called same-sex marriage an act of apostasy and punished the children of same-sex married couples, and then they rescinded it. And what the church is now starting to do is just say, hey, you know what? Prophets make mistakes, and the church implements policies and then changes them. And what they're basically acknowledging is that prophets and apostles are men, and men meaning male in terms of gender or sex type, and fallible. And what I love about that is it provides this space for women to say, well, male Mormon patriarchal theology got us polygamy. But I like women saying, well, what if women started feeling empowered to create their own theology, their own interpretations of scripture? What creative things might come about? And I just like the idea of faithful Mormon, progressive, and post-Mormon women feeling empowered with their spirituality to start deciding for themselves what God is like, male, female, other, what heaven might be like, what their beliefs are going to be about heaven and their families and their own worth, and just really becoming creative and empowered. That seems like a really exciting place for women to be able to go, is taking back their theology and their spirituality and deciding for themselves what they want to believe and don't, and what gets them excited. And maybe even teaching us men a better vision for spirituality and theology and heaven and afterlife, because frankly, the male informed version of God and of heaven and of theology just isn't appealing to me. So I'd love alternatives. Margi, just really quickly, we did a really extensive Mormon Stories podcast interview, which I highly recommend. Both my one with Natasha on Mormon Stories podcast, where Natasha talks about some very sweet and tender life experiences around youth and sexuality and awakening as an adult. Please check out Natasha Helfer Parker's Mormon Stories interview. Also, Margi did one where she talked a lot about her journey. And one of the things that's most memorable to me and many people about my interview with you, Margi, is when you said you're not very interested in beliefs. So can you talk about that other perspective really quick about, as a woman, what the role theology and doctrine about an afterlife, what that plays for you now?
Sure. I feel like, first of all, in all this talk of kind of eternal families, what I do see is this is the first kind of hit at the existential tower, right? Where we're starting to talk about how we want to conceptualize things that we can't really know, right? It's after we die. It's after. And so this is really, I feel like, deep stuff. deeply personal to people. But yeah, I feel like amidst my own transition story, I did shift a bit away from feeling very fixed around what I believe. So, and I think the reason why was I started to see that, you know, beliefs don't always inform how we relate to the present moment, how we react to our children, how we respond to our husbands, and so I needed something that I felt like helped me live a life that I felt like was more present moment oriented. And beliefs just didn't do that. And an example of that is I can believe in Jesus. I can believe that, you know, Jesus taught love and acceptance, right? But I can still be really, really short with the grocery clerk or treat people badly who are serving me at a restaurant. And so the thing that really helped me, and this is very Eckhart Tolle influenced, but was starting to connect with my own values, with a sense of wanting to connect in the present moment in a really full way, to be as present as I can with those I'm with, to really listen, to really try and create space for that. And so, yeah, that's why I think I've moved away from, I think also beliefs.
Away from what?
From a belief mindset that my identity is tied to what I believe or what I think I know. And I think the other thing is because there's something to beliefs that tend to close a door. You feel like you've figured something out, or you feel like
you get God, or you get the afterlife. None of us have any idea if there is a God or if there's an afterlife. One, if there are, or two, what they are. What are we doing for eternity? Does anybody really know? What is God really like if there's an all-powerful, loving being out there? We don't know.
Yeah. And I completely acknowledge this is a personal process for everyone, and what works for you will be different from, clearly what I have ended up with. But that's the reason why I prefer curiosity. I really love resonance, the idea of I like ideas, and then I I may take some things or not, but I also really love this sense of openness. I'll always be looking, I'll always be taking in new information. And there's a great dose of mystery in there, things that I can just fully acknowledge I probably will not know. And so it all falls back to the present moment. That's all I know. Any future I'm dreaming about, anything that I am recalling in my past, it all happens here in this moment right now. So in that way, it is my most fully empowered place. It's just right here. So that, in short, is my kind of belief, move away from belief and moving into to sort of a different way of, looking at my experience and valuing my life.
And there's a loss where you lose certainty and you lose this, and I believe, manufactured sense of security that you understand God in the afterlife. And that can be a loss for people. What I've seen many women do is swap that out for a focus on the present moment, where you're wanting to make every day the best day you can make it. You're wanting to have as much joy with yourself, with your spouse, with your kids, with your life, with your career. Because if you don't know about the future, all you have is today, then you lose the security of the future, but you gain an increased appreciation for each moment, each day. And for so many people, that really dramatically enriches their lives, especially women.
Mm-hmm.
So a few comments I'll bring up. First of all, Carlene Williams says, hi, Natasha. Hi, Carlene. She's here in Wichita with me. Hillary Dalton says, post-resignation, I'm happily autoerotic. I like that term. Neither of my two temple marriages, which ended in divorce, were sexually satisfying. My primary focus in life is cultivating my own pleasure and independence, financial, emotional, sexual, intellectual. Mormonism is miserably stultifying when it comes to teaching its women how to captain their own fates.
Ooh, beautiful.
Yeah, really beautiful. And then April Newman says, President Nelson's talk this last conference is what finally broke my shelf. After crying for a few hours that I couldn't be with my husband anymore because I was having doubts, I had a paradigm shift. And I decided I didn't have to believe it anymore because I felt God would not separate us. And that's the moment I decided he was not a prophet. So yeah, really powerful stuff. And I think this goes into my next point, which is kind of what we're already talking about, which I think that one thing that we need to think about from a perspective of being women raised as Mormon is how it's affected our spiritual identity. A lot of what you're talking about right now, John, has to do with that. And I think there's a huge kind of weird paradigm between this idea that we're so spiritual, we don't need things like the priesthood, and we're so special, and we're kind of placed on these weird pedestals without any power. And yet our roles are very limited, and our voices are very much placed under the authority of men always, even, as a person who's been in the highest level leadership position, in my ward as a Relief Society president, it was very obvious that I was still very much under male authority, including whether or not I could be in the building by myself, things that just come at a bit of spiritual, I would say, stifling. Because if my role is to look towards my husband for a blessing, or for my husband to have an answer to a prayer about a decision that we're going to make as a family, or a need for a certain power that I don't hold myself in order to really truly be spiritually complete, I'm constantly in deficit spiritually. And talking with a dear friend of mine, Lisa Butterworth, about the priesthood and how we've conceptualized the power of God in this very male gendered way, is really interesting. That even if we were to ever be given the priesthood, in her eyes, we would be accepting a male given context of what the power of God is about. So even in the most kind of thing, you hear the Catholic nuns and, fighting for kind of authority in their space. And, you have ordained women in our space. And there's lots of ways that women are speaking out in spiritual spaces about these power dynamics. And yet the priesthood, however it's been conceptualized for people, has really always been, and even if it's given to women by men. And there's something problematic about that context to begin with. So the whole thing is just spiritually stifling when you think about yourself as a spiritual being, spiritually autonomous, able to have. Mormonism, I think, offered me a lot of positives. I mean, I did like that Mormonism offered me the thought that I could talk to God on my own, that I could have answers from God on my own. There was some level of personal revelation, right, that was helpful. And yet it's in this very patriarchal, stifling context that always had me second guessing. Because if my spiritual ideas came into conflict with a man's spiritual ideas, especially a man in higher authority than me, my idea always lost.
Yes.
And how am I supposed to spiritually trust myself in that realm?
Yeah, we're kind of perpetually vulnerable to kind of whoever the patriarch at the moment is in our lives. Yeah, on some level.
Let me ask you guys really quickly the second part of the point I brought up, which is the fear that a faith crisis will lead to marital infidelity. Natasha, what keeps you from cheating on Andy, assuming that you don't? What keeps couples that you are aware of who have been through a faith crisis, male or female? What do you think there's a correlation between infidelity and a faith crisis? And talk about that if you don't mind. And then Margie, I want to hear your thoughts on the same issue.
I don't know that I have much to say about that. I mean, Mormons have affairs all the time.
You're saying believing Orthodox Mormons.
Right. I worked with infidelity throughout my entire career, working with all kinds of Mormons. So I think that's kind of one of those false narratives that somehow if you leave the church, or if you're doubting in the church, your behavior is somehow going to become immoral or bad in some way. And so I think, what are the classic slippery slope type of narratives, right? Like you're going to start sinning in some way or another. And the way we conceptualize sin, the biggest way we talk about sin is sexual for some reason in Mormon culture, whether it's porn or affairs, or, nobody talks about, oh my gosh, you're losing your faith. Are you going to start like
serving the needy?
Yeah. Are you going to start like, stealing from your neighbors? Are you going to start like becoming
embezzling money from
are you going to be embezzling money? Are you going to, nobody talks about these other ways that people kind of are rotten to other people, right? And so we're kind of fixated on sexual ideas for some reason. So I think that there can be a risk for infidelity when there's a faith transition, just because I think that there's a risk for shifts in a relationship that may have dissatisfactions in it, or if you feel like you can't talk to your person, or if you feel like you're not understood by your person, or if you feel lonely or ostracized from your person. But again, there's lots of non-transition reasons why people feel those ways and have affairs. And then we also are finding out that people have affairs for really no good reason at all.
That's
like
right.
People
nothing really tied to the relationship. Yeah.
Right, that people can be unfaithful and actually report having a really pretty good marriage, with their primary person. So I guess I don't have much to say in that I just don't think it's an actual issue.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a real fear that is very, very common.
Yes, it's a real fear that I think comes from the slippery slope narrative, which needs to be challenged, because life is a slippery slope.
And I do think it's interesting because there are, we do culturally as well go to fidelity as the ultimate betrayal. But there are betrayals in marriage that definitely rival, or I would even say, make infidelity not as, I just feel like
what?
Like patriarchy. I feel like patriarchy actually has it can be deeply betraying to a spouse, to a female in relationship, right? This idea that your thoughts don't matter, your needs don't matter, so I'm canceling you out because I have the authority. Like there are just there are a lot of ways to betray a partner in relationship. And I agree with Natasha that we tend to focus on the sexual one. And I do think it's, largely cultural, also religious. But I would also suggest that women are being betrayed in their marriages within a patriarchy, system, oftentimes, and kind of take that as well. So it's just, I don't know.
Also, just emotional disconnect can feel very betraying. Just like a lack of emotional intimacy, neglect. Of contempt, of neglect. Right?
Yeah.
Even physical neglect. If there's a partner that has no concern about the physical needs of the other, or that it overinvests in in-laws or in children at the expense of the partner, or that overinvests in work at the expense of the partner,
like
or
oftentimes
church service at the expense of the partner,
right? Or that job thing, right, where the man gets a job and a move is made, and the family or the wife didn't want to move. Or, I feel like, we should look at a full spectrum of healthy relationship in ways that we can show up for one another and more deeply understand what emotional intimacy looks like beyond just the scope of the sexual side is important.
What angers me so much every time I hear them talking about pornography over the pulpit, for example, is that it's a missed opportunity to talk about things that really matter, like domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And we think that we have good statistics on that as Mormons. We do not,
right?
Especially in a patriarchal system.
Right.
And domestic violence isn't always just about being beaten black and blue either. It's financial control. It's emotional abuse. It's abuse over the children. It's threatening, it's coercion, it's sexual coercion. Mm-hmm. And we talk about these silly problems versus, I don't want to say silly problems. I know that the betrayal of pornography can be very hurtful for people that felt like that wasn't part of their sexual contract together. So I'm just saying we're not focusing on here's this pulpit that you have to talk to millions of people who see you as an authority, and we're talking about, you know, whether or not we're looking at nudie photos versus whether or not we're beating our children, or whether or not your wife has control to your financial accounts. And it just boggles my mind when we lose those kinds of opportunities.
Yes, very well said. Mm-hmm.
Love it. Okay. What else, Natasha? What else are we wanting to cover today?
Well, did either one of you have anything you wanted to say about my spiritual identity piece?
I did.
Or are we done? Okay.
No, I loved what...
Because John brought it back to sex. I'm just saying.
I really loved, first of all, I loved that point. And it made me think too, you know, as we talk about your former point, that just the role of women in kind of caretaking the eternal family, taking responsibility for other people's choices, bringing this sort of whole family into heaven, ushering everyone in, and sort of the ownership of, you know, our partners. Our partners' decisions, taking feedback from patriarchy to sort of that it always has us second guessing, you know, our spiritual journey. It just occurred to me how enmeshed it all is, how, you know, there really is a lack of differentiation and, like you said, autonomy, but it's this huge distraction and weight that women carry that keeps them separate from themselves. It keeps them from this sort of empowered space of really, you know, living largely, you know, in a way that feels full and authentic, because we're constantly either taking feedback from patriarchy about how we're not doing it right, you know, when we disagree or when we may not resonate with what's being said, or we do not even have the space to consider ourselves because now we have children. And we are too worried about managing their choices and their decisions, so we all make it. And then if they don't, then we are absolutely then feeling weighted down by the guilt associated with the fact that we've got 2 children that now won't make it. And what decision, how our virtue lapsed, or how our, spiritual practice was not up to par to make this, because we have been reinforced that we're accountable. It always comes back, of course, to us. So, that's something that came up for me as you were speaking, was just, there are so many ways that we are enmeshed and kind of codependent on others as women within the structure, that it takes a while, I feel like, to disentangle all that and kind of come back to ourselves and to allow for, a sense of space and autonomy around ourselves to heal, but also to really negotiate all those things from a place of intention and awareness, like you said. So loved your point.
I'm going to bring in a few comments from people who wrote in, and we're going to maybe do a slight tangent, but I see this as part of our spiritual identity when they talk about polygamy or even abusive marriages and things like that. So Jenny says, I was being abused by my husband, controlled and abused by my church leaders, and saw Joseph Smith as the original abuser. My leaders had problems with me running our business and encouraged me to quit and stay at home with kids. Again, this is like the constant meddling I hear from ecclesiastical leaders about how women should be running their lives and whether or not they fit into that stay-at-home mom parameter. That bugs me every time. Anyway, she says, I was disciplined for asking for a divorce, lost my temple recommend, while my husband received no discipline for watching porn or going to strip clubs, kept his callings. So I know that's not necessarily indicative of how every ward works as far as how they were disciplined. And yet I do think that there's quite a large overreach of ecclesiastical leaders, either meddling in decisions of divorce, meddling in decisions about the financial autonomy of the woman in particular, and whether or not, those choices then fall into disciplinary proceedings of even temple worship, which just is very, very disheartening how many times I've heard those stories.
Yeah.
As far as polygamy, like Ashley says, polygamy in the afterlife and the way they dance around it like the elephant in the room, we women just weren't important enough for them to ever ease our discomfort over it. The first time I learned about it, I was 18, and I went to my BYU bishop in full ugly tears. He laughed at me and said, "What are you going to do if it's true? Leave the church?" It took me 8 months to not think about it every day. But every time I heard of a spouse dying and the living spouse getting remarried, it brought all of that hurt back to the surface, because we were always taught they would all three be together. And Lexi says, as a woman and mother, learning that Joseph Smith had taken so many wives, and particularly minors, was extremely upsetting. The fact that he had exploited them and their families by telling them they would receive exaltation, or by saying he was commanded by an angel with a flaming sword, was disgusting. Members often talk about how when Joseph Smith had the first vision, he was only 14, and so full of faith for such a young age, an incredible young man. And yet apologists claim 14 is very mature when it comes to the young women he married. It just boggles my mind. So I bring these up because I do think this is very much tied to spiritual identity as a Mormon woman. You know, the roles that we're expected to play, how we're supposed to make sense of our history, how we're supposed to make sense of things that still have not been addressed. We still very much live under a polygamist construct for the afterlife, and in our temples and our wedding ceremonies. The changes that they made in the temple for women, albeit I think very positive, did nothing to address the polygamy question. And that continues to be, I think, something that really, I know I felt like there was something spiritually wrong with me, that I couldn't be more accepting of that concept. For a long time. I felt that somehow I wasn't mature enough, spiritual enough, enlightened enough, whatever enough to be able to get the polygamy narrative.
Yeah.
And I love Carolyn Pearson's book, The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy. Everyone should read that book. Carolyn Pearson is a faithful, believing, active Mormon feminist woman. But I interviewed her on Mormon Stories podcast, and also you can just buy her book and read it. But it talks about how polygamy, whether it's the, pedophilia, instances that are covered up in the church, the sexual abuse instances that are in the church for children or for adult women, assault kind of things, patriarchy, polygamy is very much still with us. Our inability to, our desire in Mormon church leadership these days of protecting abusers at the expense of the abused, of feeling like the needs of women and children are somehow less important than the need to protect the church, to protect the institution, or to protect male abusers is still very much haunting us, along with, our culture of secrecy and of self-protection and of paranoia. All of that has its roots in polygamy. And if you think that, for those of you who buy the line that the polygamy isn't doctrinal anymore and that we don't really have anything to do with it anymore, that's, I think you're missing a really important aspect of where and how Mormonism needs to heal. I'll also add that Section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants is still canonized, and we have Mormon prophets today who are entering into polygamous marriages with new female spouses after their current spouses have died, after their previous spouses passed away. Elder Oaks is in a polygamous celestial marriage. Russell M. Nelson's in a polygamous celestial marriage, and there are others. And so,
and please understand, because I think sometimes some women still don't understand, a woman cannot do that. A woman cannot be sealed to more than one husband while she's alive.
Yes. And all that around the cancellation of sealings, and how the man can divorce one woman and automatically be sealed to subsequent women without any need of a cancellation or of approval. But women, if they divorce their first husband and want to be sealed to a new man, they have to grovel and ask their previous husband for permission and go through the sealing cancellation process, which is just really ugly and disturbing. And the church is hesitant to grant sealing cancellations for women who don't have some man ready and lined up to marry in the temple. So it's almost like the church would prefer that a woman stay sealed to a man who she no longer wants to be sealed to, because in heaven it's better that she be sealed to some man than no man at all. Whereas there are women who just don't feel that way. And there's a lot of heartbreak around how the church, the disparity between how the church handles sealing cancellations and temple marriage with men versus women. It's really a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a whole podcast in of itself, which you have done, I think, with, like you said, Carolyn Pearson. I know I've done some on this issue as well. Yeah. And it affects women. It affects our sexuality. It affects our spiritual identity. It affects our ability to fully commit. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to women just in marital counseling where she's like, I feel a little bit walled off from this man that I feel like at some point I'm going to have to share with another woman. Mm-hmm. Imagine living your life, the here and now, the present moment, with that kind of story, that narrative, and playing in the back of your head. I know I felt that way. Mm-hmm. Andy felt it was appropriate to make jokes about that during the first part of our marriage.
Yeah.
That we would, someday you're going to have to share me. Ha ha ha. Those things had profound impacts on our current marriage that we had to talk about and heal from years later. So that is something that is currently harming all of our women and our girls.